Welcome back to our channel. Today we confront the shattering reality behind the final days of Hollywood's golden couple Clark Gable and Carole Lombard. To the world they were the king and queen, an unbreakable force. But inside their Encino ranch, the fairy tale was fracturing under the weight of jealousy. Just days before the tragedy, their marriage was rocked by rumors of Gable's affair with co-star Lana Turner, a betrayal that pushed Lombard to the brink. She didn't just leave for Indiana to sell war bonds. She left to prove her independence to a husband she feared losing. She left in anger, but she would return in silence. A plane crash on a snowy mountain denied them the chance to say, "I'm sorry." This is not just the story of a star's death. It is the story of Gable's lifelong struggle with the guilt of an unresolved fight, and why the king of Hollywood chose a path of self-destruction. To understand the man he became, you must understand the moment he stopped living and started haunting his own life. The story of the most profitable tragedy in Hollywood history does not begin with a plane crash on a snowy mountain. It begins in a boardroom in Culver City where human beings were itemized on balance sheets as depreciating assets. By January 1942, MGM owned more than just his contract. They owned his grief. He was less a man and more a trademark. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the studio that boasted it, had more stars than there are in heaven, had spent a decade constructing the entity known as Clark Gable. They had fixed his teeth, taped back his ears, lowered his voice, and taught him how to walk with a swagger that suggested he owned every room he entered. In return for this fabrication, they owned him. They determined which words he spoke, which women he kissed, and, crucially, how he was perceived by the American public. In the winter of 1941, Gable was the single most valuable export of the American film industry. He had played Rhett Butler just 2 years earlier, cementing a specific brand of masculinity that the country was obsessed with: rugged, cynical, sexually aggressive, and unbreakable. He was the king of Hollywood, a title he reportedly hated because he knew better than anyone that kings are just targets with crowns. Living inside this golden cage was suffocating. Gable was a man of simple, dirt-level appetites. He liked fixing engines, shooting ducks, and drinking whiskey, trapped in a world of velvet ropes. He was constantly anxious, terrified of being exposed as a fraud, terrified that the poverty of his Ohio childhood would come back to claim him. He needed an anchor. He needed someone who didn't give a damn about the king. He found her in Carole Lombard. While Gable was grounded and often silent, Lombard was chaotic, loud, and electric. She was the highest-paid actress in the world, the queen of screwball comedy, a woman with a face like an angel and the vocabulary of a longshoreman. She was the only person in Hollywood who wasn't afraid of Clark Gable. She called him Pa. She mocked his vanity. She dragged him out of his shell. They married in 1939 during a break in the filming of Gone with the Wind. They bought a 20-acre ranch in Encino, a dusty outpost in the San Fernando Valley. It wasn't a mansion, it was a farmhouse. They filled it with chickens, horses, and dogs. For 2 years, it was the only place on earth where Clark Gable was just a man, but the outside world was burning. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 changed the physics of Hollywood. The Dream Factory was suddenly tasked with manufacturing patriotism. The Roosevelt administration leaned heavily on the studio heads. They needed the stars to sell the war. They needed the faces on the silver screen to tell the American public to open their wallets and buy war bonds. Louis B. Mayer, the tyrannical head of MGM, saw this not just as a patriotic duty, but as a way to protect his investments. If the studios were seen as essential to the war effort, they could avoid government rationing of film stock and protect their stars from the draft. Clark Gable was 40 years old. He was technically too old for the draft, but the pressure on him was immense. He was the symbol of American virility. How could the king sit in Chino while boys were dying in the Pacific? The pressure didn't just come from his conscience. It came from the newly formed Hollywood Victory Committee, a bureaucratic organ that merged the glamour of the movies with the grim necessities of the War Department. Overnight, the studios had been converted into a propaganda arm of the government. The logic was cold and undeniable. A tank costs money, a bomber costs money, but a movie star could generate that money out of thin air simply by smiling and shaking hands. Stars were assigned quotas of bond sales. They were given itineraries that were more grueling than military campaigns. The studio heads, terrified of being labeled war profiteers, or worse, unpatriotic in a time of xenophobia, offered up their actors as tribute. Clark Gable wasn't just a man deciding whether to serve, he was a strategic resource being fought over by generals and producers. The Army wanted him for recruitment. The Treasury Department wanted him for bonds. MGM wanted him to stay safe and keep making movies. He was caught in a pincer movement of guilt and obligation. Every newspaper headline about the fall of Manila or the losses in the Atlantic felt like a personal accusation. The King title, once a marketing gimmick, now felt like a curse. Kings lead armies. They don't hide in the San Fernando Valley raising chickens. The public expectation was a physical weight. They didn't want Clark Gable, the actor. They wanted Rhett Butler, the blockade runner. They wanted the fiction to step off the screen and save the reality. And in the center of this geopolitical storm, Gable just wanted to stay home with his wife, fully aware that the moment he stepped out the door, he ceased to be a husband and became a national monument. Carole Lombard felt this pressure acutely. She was a woman of intense vibrating energy. She wanted to do something. She wanted to fight. Since she couldn't carry a rifle, she decided to carry the sales pitch. She volunteered to lead a massive war bond drive in her home state of Indiana. She asked Gable to go with her. He refused. This refusal is the first pivot point in the tragedy. Gable hated crowds. He hated speaking in public without a script. He felt like a carnival barker asking people for money. But there was another darker reason for his hesitation, one that the studio fixers worked very hard to erase from the narrative. The marriage, though deeply loving, was volatile. They were two high-octane personalities living under a microscope. In the weeks leading up to the Bond tour, there was tension. There were rumors, always rumors, about Gable's wandering eye. He was currently filming Somewhere I'll Find You with Lana Turner, a woman known in the industry as a sexual termite for her ability to eat through marriages. Lombard was jealous. She was insecure. The idea of leaving Gable alone in Hollywood with Lana Turner while she went to freezing Indiana gnawed at her. But her patriotism, and perhaps her need to prove her own independence, won out. So a deal was struck. Lombard would go to Indiana. She would take her mother, Elizabeth Peters, and MGM's publicity man, Otto Winkler, to chaperone her. Gable would stay in Los Angeles and finish the picture. The departure was not the tearful romantic farewell that the movies later depicted. It was fraught with the unspoken anxieties of a couple who knew the fragility of their happiness. Lombard left the ranch with a sense of mission, but also a sense of hurry. She wanted to get there, sell the bonds, and get back to guard her territory. The tour was a smashing, exhausting success. In Indianapolis, standing in the rotunda of the state capitol, Carole Lombard sold $2 million worth of bonds in a single day. She signed autographs until her hand cramped. She smiled until her face hurt. She gave the government everything she had. On the evening of January 15, 1942, The mission was accomplished. The party was exhausted. They were scheduled to take a train back to Los Angeles. The train was slow, safe, and relaxing. It would take 3 days. But Lombard was manic with the need to return. She missed Gable. She didn't want to spend 3 days chugging across the plains. She wanted to fly. Her mother, Elizabeth, was terrified of flying. She had a premonition, a heavy, dark feeling about the plane. She begged Carole to stick to the itinerary. Otto Winkler, the MGM handler, also advised against it. The weather was bad, the flight paths were altered due to the war, and winter aviation in 1942 was still a risky proposition. They stood in the lobby of the Claypool Hotel, arguing. The Queen of Screwball, the terrified mother, and the studio fixer. To settle the argument, Carole Lombard did something that fits the grim absurdity of her fate perfectly. She pulled a coin out of her pocket. Heads we fly, tails we take the train. She flipped the nickel into the air. It spun under the hotel chandelier, a small disc of metal deciding the future of the King of Hollywood. It landed on heads. Lombard cheered. She was going home. She sent a telegram to Gable. "Paps, you better get yourself into shape because I'll be back and I'll be ready." It was a sexually charged, playful message, the kind of note a wife sends when she is eager to reclaim her husband. Gable received the telegram at the ranch. He was thrilled. He began preparations for a homecoming party. He didn't know about the coin toss. He didn't know about the argument. He only knew that the house, which felt like a tomb when she was gone, was about to come alive again. He ordered champagne. He had the servants prepare her favorite dinner. He bought patriotic streamers to hang in the dining room to celebrate her record-breaking sales. He was the happiest he had been in weeks. Meanwhile, at the Indianapolis airport, TWA Flight 3 was waiting. It was a DC-3, the workhorse of the skies. It was reliable, sturdy, and uncomfortable. Lombard, her mother, and Winkler boarded the plane, along with 19 other passengers, mostly Army Air Corps pilots faring to new assignments. Because of the war, the windows were blacked out. The passengers couldn't see the ground. They were sealed in a metal tube, trusting the pilots to navigate the invisible highways of the sky. The flight had stops scheduled in St. Louis, Albuquerque, and Las Vegas. It was a long, jagged route across the continent. In Los Angeles, Eddie Mannix, the MGM general manager, was doing what he always did, managing the assets. Mannix was a legend in Hollywood, but not for his art. He was a former bouncer from New Jersey with ties to the mob. His title was general manager, but his job was fixer. If a star got a girl pregnant, Mannix arranged the abortion. If a star got arrested for drunk driving, Mannix made the police report disappear. He was the studio's brutal enforcer. Mannix knew the Bond tour was good PR. He was already planning the press releases celebrating Lombard's return. He viewed Gable and Lombard not as people, but as the crown jewels of the studio's portfolio. Their marriage was a marketing hook that appealed to every demographic, the rugged man and the wild woman. Keeping them happy and keeping them working was his primary objective. On the afternoon of January 16th, Flight 3 landed in Las Vegas to refuel. It was the final stop before Los Angeles. They were less than 2 hours from home. However, a complication arose. The war effort demanded priority seating. An Army officer told the TWA agents that they needed seats for essential military personnel. They wanted to bump the civilians off the flight. Lombard argued. She pulled rank. She wasn't just a civilian. She was Carole Lombard. She had just raised millions for the government. She argued that she, too, was essential. After a heated discussion, she was allowed to stay on the plane. But 3 other civilians were removed to make room for the ferry pilots. It was the second time chance had intervened to keep her on that plane. First the coin toss, then the argument over the seats. It seemed like a fatal chain of events was pulling her toward that plane. The plane took off from Las Vegas at 7:07 p.m. The sun had set. The desert was pitch black. Because of the war, the warning beacons on the mountain peaks, the lighthouses of the sky, were dimmed or extinguished to prevent enemy bombers from using them for navigation. The pilots were flying on instruments in the dark through a corridor of stone. Back in Encino, the party preparations were complete. The candles were ready to be lit. Clark Gable checked his watch. She should be landing soon. He imagined her walking through the door, throwing her coat on the floor, and laughing that loud, unladylike laugh that washed away his anxiety. He poured himself a drink. He didn't know it, but it was the last drink he would ever have as a whole man. The clock on the wall was ticking towards 7:20 p.m. At that exact moment, over the Possi Mountain range in Nevada, the pilot of Flight 3 was slightly off course. He believed he was clearing the peaks. He was wrong. The plane was flying at 170 miles per hour, directly into a sheer granite cliff face. There was no distress call. There was no time to be afraid. 1 second, Carole Lombard was sitting in the dark, clutching the ruby brooch Gable had given her, thinking about the ranch. The next second, the world ended. The impact was so violent that the plane didn't just crash, it atomized. The explosion lit up the dark Nevada sky like a flare. In Los Angeles, the phone rang at the home of Eddie Mannix. It was an MGM contact in Las Vegas. There was a report of a fire on the mountain. A plane was missing. Mannix didn't panic. He went into operational mode. He knew he had to get to Gable before the press did. He knew that if this was a crash, it wasn't just a tragedy. It was a crisis management situation of the highest order. The king was about to be broken, and MGM needed to be there to pick up the pieces, not to heal him, but to make sure he shattered in a way that was photogenic. The timeline reveals the studio's ruthlessness. Before the fires on Possi Mountain had even burned out, before the coroner had even arrived at the base of the cliff, the MGM publicity machine was already writing the obituary. This was the business of death in its purest form. Eddie Mannix and publicity chief Howard Strickling initiated a protocol of containment. The first step was the control of information. MGM security personnel were dispatched to Las Vegas, not to help with the rescue, but to secure the perimeter against freelance photographers. They needed to ensure that no unauthorized image of the carnage, and specifically, no image of Carole Lombard's remains, ever saw the light of day. A photo of a mutilated star would destroy the illusion of glamour that the industry relied on. They were protecting the brand from the biological reality of the crash. Simultaneously, they began drafting the narrative for Gable. They knew the press would be hungry for a reaction, so they manufactured one. They prepared statements attributing stoic, patriotic quotes to a man who was currently in a state of catatonic shock. They decided in that boardroom vacuum that Gable would play the role of the tragic soldier. They would frame Lombard's death not as a senseless accident caused by pilot error or darkness, but as the first combat casualty of the home front. By linking her death to the bond drive, they ennobled the tragedy. They turned a gruesome plane crash into a sacrificial act. It was a masterstroke of dark PR. They couldn't save her life, so they saved her box office value, ensuring that her final film, to be or not to be, would be a smash hit rather than a macabre footnote. They were monetizing the corpse before it was even recovered. Mannix drove to the Encino Ranch. He found Gable waiting for his wife. When Mannix told him the plane was missing, Gable didn't collapse. He grabbed his coat. He wanted to go. He wanted to drive to the airport. He wanted to fly to Vegas. He wanted to tear the mountain down with his bare hands. Mannix stopped him. He told him they would charter a plane. He told him to stay calm. He began the process of containment. As they drove to the airport to board the charter flight to Las Vegas, Clark Gable sat in the back of the car, staring out at the darkness. The silence that descended on him in that car would last for the rest of his life. He was still the king of Hollywood, but the kingdom had just been bombed, and the studio that made him was already figuring out how to sell the wreckage. The chartered flight from Los Angeles to Las Vegas carried a cargo of dread. Clark Gable sat in silence, flanked by Eddie Mannix and a few close friends who had been summoned to the Encino Ranch. The flight was short, barely an hour, but it marked the transition from Gable's life as a man with a future to his life as a man haunted by the past. When they landed in Las Vegas, the city was not the neon sprawl we know today. It was a dusty desert outpost, tense with the energy of the war and the sudden, frantic activity of the search and rescue teams. Gable was taken immediately to the El Rancho Vegas hotel. Mannix established a command center in a bungalow, effectively placing Gable under house arrest. The MGM fixer knew that the press was already descending on the city. Reporters from every major paper in the country were scrambling to get the scoop. Was the Queen of Hollywood dead? How was the king taking it? Mannix's job was to ensure that the answers to those questions were controlled, dignified, and brand appropriate. He stationed guards at the door. He fielded the calls. He became the filter through which Gable experienced his own tragedy. Meanwhile, the search party was assembling. The terrain of Possi Mountain is unforgiving, steep, rocky, and covered in deep snow. It was the middle of the night, freezing cold, and the site of the fire was high up on a cliff face known as Double Up Peak. The local sheriff and military personnel prepared for a grueling climb. Gable insisted on going. He wanted to climb the mountain. He needed to see. Mannix physically blocked him. He argued that Gable was not equipped for the climb, that he would slow down the rescue team, that he would be a liability. It was a rational argument, but the motivation was cynical. Mannix knew what plane crashes looked like. He knew that if a DC-3 hit a granite wall at 170 miles per hour, there would be no survivors. There would be no bodies to hold. There would only be carnage. He could not let the studio's most valuable asset see his wife reduced to biological debris. It would break him in a way that couldn't be fixed by a vacation or a new script. So Gable stayed behind. He paced the bungalow. He drank coffee. He smoked cigarettes until the room was blue with haze. He waited. Mannix joined the search party. He was 50 years old, a heavy smoker with a bad heart, but he hiked up that mountain. He needed to see the evidence with his own eyes. He needed to know exactly what the studio was dealing with. The climb took hours. When they finally reached the crash site, the sun was coming up. The scene was apocalyptic. The snow was blackened by fuel and fire. The wreckage was scattered over a wide area. Shards of metal mixed with the contents of suitcases and the remains of 22 human beings. It was immediately clear that no one had survived. The impact had been catastrophic. Mannix walked through the slaughterhouse. He found Otto Winkler, his friend and colleague, or what was left of him. He found the bodies of the pilot and co-pilot. And then he found the women. The identification was difficult, but they found fragments of jewelry. They found the ruby brooch Gable had given Carole. It was twisted and burned, but unmistakable. Mannix came down the mountain with the brooch in his pocket. He returned to the El Rancho Vegas. He walked into the bungalow where Gable was waiting. He didn't have to speak. Gable saw his face and knew. The hope that had sustained him for the last 12 hours, the irrational, desperate hope that maybe she had been thrown clear, maybe she was hurt but alive, evaporated. Gable took the brooch. He didn't scream. He didn't throw things. He simply collapsed into a chair and put his head in his hands. He let out a sound that witnesses described not as a cry, but as a moan, a deep animal noise of total defeat. The next few days were a blur of logistical horror. The bodies had to be brought down from the mountain on pack mules. It was a slow, gruesome procession. Gable wanted to stay until she was brought down. He wouldn't leave Las Vegas without her. Mannix arranged for the transport of the remains to Los Angeles by train. The train ride home was a funeral procession on rails. Gable sat in a private compartment with the coffins of his wife, his mother-in-law, and his friend Otto. He sat there for hours, staring at the boxes. He was surrounded by the physical reality of death, but he was also surrounded by the invisible machinery of the studio. Back in Los Angeles, MGM took over the funeral arrangements. Carole Lombard had left specific instructions in her will. She wanted a simple private funeral. She didn't want a circus, but she was the first female casualty of the war effort, a martyr who died selling bonds. The government wanted a hero's burial. The public wanted a spectacle. MGM navigated this by staging a private funeral at Forest Lawn that was covered by the press as if it were a state event. They controlled the guest list. They controlled the images. The photos released to the papers showed Gable standing by the grave, looking stoic and shattered. He was wearing a dark suit and sunglasses. He looked exactly like the tragic hero the audience expected. But behind the sunglasses, Gable was disintegrating. He returned to the Encino Ranch, and the silence of the house hit him like a physical blow. The party streamers he had hung for her homecoming were still up. The champagne was still in the refrigerator. He ordered the servants to leave everything exactly as it was. He wouldn't let them clean her bedroom. He wouldn't let them move her hairbrush. He slept with her scarf. He spent his days wandering the 20 acres of the property, checking the fences, feeding the animals she loved, trying to keep her world alive by sheer force of will. He began to drink heavily, not the social drinking of the Hollywood parties, but a dark, solitary consumption designed to numb the brain. He would drink scotch by the case. He would get on his motorcycle and ride through the canyons at terrifying speeds, pushing the machine to its limit, perhaps hoping that a curve would miss him, that a slick patch of oil would send him over the edge to join her. MGM gave him a month. It sounds cruel, and it was. But in the studio system, grief had a schedule. Gable was in the middle of filming Somewhere I'll Find You. The production was halted. The sets were sitting idle. The crew was on hold. Every day Gable stayed at the ranch was costing the studio thousands of dollars. Louis B. Mayer sent emissaries. They didn't come with threats. They came with guilt. They told Gable that the crew needed the work. They told him that Carole was a professional, that she would have wanted him to finish the job. They used his wife's work ethic as a weapon against his mourning. Eventually it worked. Gable agreed to return to the set. The day he walked back onto the MGM lot, the atmosphere was suffocating. The studio had issued a memo, the silence policy. No one was to mention the crash. No one was to offer condolences. No one was to say her name. They were to treat him exactly as they had before, as if the most violent event of his life hadn't happened. Imagine the psychology of this. Gable walks onto the soundstage, his heart flayed open, and is met with a wall of cheerful denial. The makeup artist powders his face and talks about the weather. The lighting guys joke about baseball. The director discusses the blocking of the scene. It was a conspiracy of normalcy. This silence policy was not an act of kindness. It was a psychological sterilization technique. The studio psychologists and executives believed that if they removed the language of grief, they could remove the performance of grief. They treated Gable's trauma like a continuity error in a script, something to be edited out so the show could go on. Every minute Gable spent mourning was a minute he wasn't earning. The overhead on the production of Somewhere I'll Find You was calculated at roughly $10,000 a day in 1942 money. Therefore, Gable's tears had a literal price tag. The studio doctors monitored him closely, not to heal his heart, but to ensure he remained functional enough to stand on his mark. They prescribed sedatives to make him sleep and stimulants to wake him up, beginning a chemical cycle of control that would plague him for the rest of his life. It was the ultimate expression of the studio's ownership. They claimed the right to regulate his internal atmosphere. He was surrounded by hundreds of people, grips, electrics, costumers, who were all under strict orders to ignore the visible hollowness in his eyes. It was a form of gaslighting on an industrial scale. By refusing to acknowledge the death, they forced Gable to compartmentalize his agony, pushing it down into a deep, toxic reservoir that would eventually poison his body. They didn't just forbid him from crying, they forbade him from being human. They demanded the trademark, the swagger, and the dimples, effectively forcing him to play the role of Clark Gable while he was emotionally dead inside. The scene they had to shoot was a romantic comedy scene. He had to flirt with Lana Turner, he had to be charming, he had to be Rhett Butler. When the director yelled action, Gable turned it on. He smiled. He delivered the lines with that famous confident drawl, but when the director yelled cut, the mask fell. Gable would tremble. He would retreat to his dressing room and stare at the mirror, his face gray and aged. The strain was visible on film. If you watch Somewhere I'll Find You today, you can see the difference in Gable's face between the scenes shot before the crash and the scenes shot after. In the later scenes, he looks thinner. The lines around his mouth are deeper. His eyes have a flat, dead quality. He isn't acting, he is enduring. The movie was finished, but MGM knew they had a problem. The king was broken. He wasn't the same asset he was in 1941. He was ghost-walking through his life. They needed a way to fix his image, to explain the change in him to the public, and to give him a break from the grind of romance movies that he clearly couldn't handle anymore. The war offered the solution. Carole Lombard had urged him to enlist. She had wanted him to be a real hero, not just a movie hero. Now, with her gone, her wish became a command. Gable decided to join the Army Air Forces. For Gable, it was a way out. It was a way to escape the ranch, escape the studio, escape the memories. For MGM, it was a marketing goldmine. MGM's publicity department spun the narrative instantly. Gable goes to war. It was the ultimate patriotic story. The grieving widower lays down his career to fight the fascists who killed his wife. Even though the crash was an accident, the narrative blurred the lines, linking her death to the war effort. Gable enlisted as a private, but everyone knew he wouldn't stay one. He was sent to officer candidate school in Miami Beach. The press followed him. Newsreels showed Gable getting his hair cut, Gable marching in formation, Gable scrubbing toilets. But the reality of his service was far darker than the newsreel showed. Gable wasn't looking for medals. He was looking for death. He specifically requested to be an aerial gunner. This was insanity. Aerial gunners on B-17 bombers had one of the highest mortality rates in the war. They were exposed, targeted, and vulnerable. A man of Gable's age, he was 41, should have been behind a desk. He should have been selling bonds, but he insisted. He used his clout to get the assignment. He wanted to be in the fight. He wanted to be where the flak was thickest. MGM couldn't stop him, so they did the next best thing. They monetized his death wish. They arranged for a camera crew to accompany him to Europe. They branded it as a documentary unit. The official reason was that Gable was shooting footage for a recruitment film called Combat America. The unofficial reason was that MGM wanted to own the footage of their star in combat. If he lived, they had a hit movie. If he died, they had the most valuable obituary in history. There is something deeply cynical about sending a camera crew to film a man who is trying to die. MGM's executives were well aware of Gable's mental state. They knew he wasn't driven by patriotism as much as he was driven by a nihilistic need to be with Carole, even if that meant joining her in the wreckage of a plane. Yet, instead of intervening, they gave him a camera. The footage shot for Combat America is haunting when viewed through this lens. The documentary unit was essentially a mobile publicity department. They staged shots of Gable looking heroic in his flight jacket. They carefully framed him against the B-17S. But what they couldn't edit out was the recklessness in his eyes. The studio was effectively playing Russian roulette with their biggest star, banking on two possible outcomes, both profitable. If he survived, they had the ultimate comeback story. The warrior returns. If he died over Germany, they had hours of high-quality color footage of his final days, which could be cut into a posthumous tribute that would break every box office record in history. They had insured the asset against his own suicide. The recruitment film was a cover story. In reality, it was the pre-production of a memorial service. They were prepared to sell tickets to his funeral before he had even been killed. This is why the Nazi bounty on his head was so perverse. The Germans wanted him as a trophy, but in a way, MGM was doing the exact same thing. Both sides were hunting Clark Gable. The Germans wanted to shoot him down, and MGM wanted to capture the footage. Gable was assigned to the 351st Bomb Group at RAF Polbrook in England. He arrived in 1943. The men of the 351st were initially skeptical. They expected a prima donna. They expected him to stay in the officers' club and drink while they flew the missions. Gable surprised them. He was humble. He was quiet. He ate in the mess hall. He listened to the young pilots, boys of 20 and 21 who were terrified of dying. And he flew. He flew 5 operational combat missions over Germany. These were not safe flights. He flew into the teeth of the Luftwaffe. He stood at the waist gun, freezing in the unpressurized fuselage, watching the black puffs of flak explode around the plane. On one mission over the Ruhr Valley, the plane was hit. A shell fragment ripped through the boot of his left foot, missing his toes by a fraction of an inch, and exited through the roof just past his head. If he'd been standing 2 inches to the right, the king of Hollywood would have been a headless corpse in a crashing bomber. When the plane landed, Gable inspected the damage. He didn't look relieved. He looked resigned. He kept the piece of shrapnel as a souvenir, not of his survival, but of his failure to die. During his time in England, Gable received thousands of letters from fans. MGM had a system in place to handle them. They sent secretaries to England to filter the mail. They wanted to make sure he only saw the encouraging letters, the patriotic ones. They shielded him from the obsessed fans, the hate mail, the reality of his own celebrity. Even in a war zone, he was in a bubble. But the bubble couldn't protect him from the ghosts. Hitler knew he was there. The Nazi propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, announced that any German pilot who shot down Clark Gable would receive a promotion and a cash reward. They wanted him alive if possible. Hermann Goering wanted to put Rhett Butler in a cage and parade him through Berlin. This added a layer of surreal danger to his missions. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a trophy. The other men on his plane knew it. Flying with Gable meant you were a priority target for every Messerschmitt in the sky. Yet they respected him because he didn't hide. He stood at the gun and waited for them. MGM released Combat America in 1944. It is a strange film. It features Gable's narration, his voice familiar and reassuring, describing the brutal mechanics of air war. The footage is gritty and real, but the subtext is entirely constructed. It presents Gable as the steady fatherly warrior. It edits out the trembling hands. It edits out the nights he spent drinking alone in his quarters, staring at the photo of Carole Lombard. When he returned to the U.S. in 1944, he was a decorated hero. He had the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal. The public adored him. He had done what the other stars, John Wayne, for instance, had not. He had gone to the front. But the man who came back was not the man who left. He was deaf in one ear from the engine noise. He had a tremor in his hands. He was gray, and he was completely, utterly burned out. He went back to the ranch. He didn't want to work. He didn't want to be the king. He just wanted to be left alone. But MGM had a contract. They had an investment. They hadn't paid him through the war years just to let him retire. They needed a hit. They pushed him into adventure. The slogan was Gable's back and Garson's got him. It was a desperate attempt to recapture the magic of 1939. But the chemistry between Gable and Greer Garson was non-existent. The script was weak, and Gable looked uncomfortable. He looked like a man who had seen too much reality to pretend that a romantic misunderstanding was a serious problem. The film made money, but the critics saw the cracks. They noted that Gable seemed tired. They noted that the spark was gone. Gable knew it too. He felt like a relic. The new method actors were arriving in Hollywood. Brando, Clift, Dean. They were mumbling, crying, showing their souls. Gable came from the school of stand up straight, speak clearly, and don't let them see you bleed. He didn't fit in this new world of vulnerability. He retreated further into the ranch. His personal life became a series of failed attempts to replicate what he had lost. He married Sylvia Ashley in 1949. It was a panic move. She was British, blonde, and looked vaguely like Carole, but she was high society. She brought her own furniture to the ranch. She tried to civilize his man cave. The marriage imploded. Gable couldn't stand her presence in Carole's house. He divorced her in 1952. The pattern was clear. He was looking for a caretaker, not a lover. He wanted someone to manage his loneliness without disturbing his ghosts. He found Kay Williams. She was a woman who had been through the Hollywood grinder herself. She understood the rules. She married him in 1955 and moved into the ranch. But she didn't try to change it. She lived with the ghost. She let him talk about Carole. She let him be the sad, quiet farmer he wanted to be. For a few years, there was a kind of peace. Gable aged. He gained weight. He stopped trying to be the dashing rogue and accepted his role as the elder statesman of the studio. But the industry had one last extraction to perform. In 1960, the script for The Misfits arrived. It was written by Arthur Miller. It was directed by John Huston. It starred Marilyn Monroe and Montgomery Clift. It was the new Hollywood meeting the old Hollywood. Gable played Gay Langland, an aging cowboy who captures wild Mustangs in the Nevada desert to sell them for dog food. The character was a man out of time, a man whose way of life was dying, a man who was tired of hunting things down. It was the role of his life because it was his life. The production was a physical and emotional ordeal. They were shooting in the Nevada desert, in the blistering heat, the same desert where Carole's plane had gone down. Every day, Gable looked at those mountains. Marilyn Monroe was a wreck. She was late. She was high. She was incapable of remembering lines. Gable waited. He sat in the heat, dressed in his cowboy gear, sweating, smoking, waiting for the young queen to come out of her trailer. He didn't get angry. He felt a strange kinship with her. He saw the same panic in her eyes that he felt in his own heart. He saw a creature being eaten alive by the studio, just like he had been. He insisted on doing his own stunts. There is a scene where he has to rope a wild stallion. He is dragged through the dust. He fights the animal with a desperate physical intensity. He was 59 years old. He had a heart condition. but he wouldn't let a stuntman do it. He had to prove he was still Clark Gable. The scene is terrifying to watch. You are watching a man kill himself for a camera angle. You are watching the final expenditure of the asset. By 1960, the Clark Gable entity was a crumbling facade held together by willpower and chemistry. The years of forbidden grief had manifested physically. The unwept tears and the suppressed rage had turned into hypertension, arterial sclerosis, and a heart muscle that was exhausted from carrying the weight of a legend. The industry, however, had one final extraction to perform. The insurance doctors for the Misfits knew he was in bad shape. They knew his resting heart rate was alarmingly high. They knew he had the tremors of a man who had self-medicated for 20 years. But the production could not be insured without him, so he was passed. He was cleared for duty in the 105-degree desert heat. It was a form of slow-motion manslaughter. The director, John Huston, and the studio executives watched as he dragged himself through the sand, his face gray, his breath short. They saw the signs of a man dying on his feet, but the schedule was tight, and the budget was ballooning due to Monroe's delays. So they let him do it. They let him destroy what was left of his physical reserves for the sake of authenticity. They needed the shot. They needed the image of the cowboy wrestling the horse. They extracted the performance from his dying body with the same ruthless efficiency that they had extracted the bond sales from his grieving soul in 1942. When he said, "I've never been so tired," he wasn't talking about a day's work. He was talking about a lifetime of being consumed. When the film wrapped on November 4th, 1960, Gable was gray. He told a friend, "I'm glad it's over. I've never been so tired in my life." 2 days later at the ranch, he felt a crushing pain in his chest. It was the bill coming due, the smoking, the drinking, the stress, the grief. It all arrived at once. He was taken to the hospital. For 10 days he lingered. He seemed to be getting better. He read magazines, he talked to Kay. But on November 16th, 1960, he simply stopped. He turned a page of a magazine, closed his eyes, and suffered a final, fatal heart attack. The studio system that had controlled his life immediately moved to control his death. The funeral arrangements were swift and precise. He was not to be buried as a private citizen. He was to be buried as a legend. His body was taken to Forest Lawn. The crypt had been waiting for 18 years. It was next to Carole Lombard, Kay Williams, the pregnant widow, the woman who had actually comforted him in his final years, stood by the grave. She knew her place. She knew that in the eyes of the world, she was a footnote. The real marriage, the eternal marriage, was the one the studio had marketed. By burying him next to Lombard, MGM sealed the package. They ensured that for all of eternity, Clark Gable would be defined by the tragedy of 1942. They locked him in the narrative of the grieving lover. They denied him the complexity of his later years, the messiness of his other marriages, the reality of his pain. He was finally back with her, but he was also back in the box. The king was dead, but the brand was immortal. The funeral of Clark Gable in November 1960 was a masterclass in stage management, but the credits did not roll when the crypt door closed. If the studio believed that burying the king next to his queen at Forest Lawn was the final scene, they had underestimated the messy biological reality of the legacy he left behind. The silence of the mausoleum was immediately replaced by the noise of the lawyers, the estate agents, and the tabloids, all circling the one thing Clark Gable could not take with him: his unborn son. Kay Williams returned to the ranch in Encino as a widow entering her third trimester. She was a woman of immense resilience, having survived 2 previous abusive marriages and a heart condition, but the atmosphere inside that house would have broken anyone. The ranch was not a home. It was a shrine to Carole Lombard that she had been allowed to inhabit as a guest. For 5 years, Kay had walked on eggshells, living among the artifacts of a dead woman, sleeping in a bed that belonged to a ghost. Now, with Gable dead, the house felt even more like a museum. The guns were still in the cabinet. The tractors sat rusting in the barn. The air was thick with the expectations of a public that viewed her pregnancy not as a personal joy, but as a national event. The birth of John Clark Gable on March 20th, 1961, 4 months after his father's death, was treated with the same hysteria as a royal succession. The headline screamed, "A son for the king." It was framed as a miracle, a final act of virility from beyond the grave. Photographers camped at the gates of the hospital. The studio sent flowers, but beneath the celebration lay a grim calculus. MGM looked at the infant and saw a sequel. They saw a potential asset that, if managed correctly, could extend the Gable brand for another generation. John Clark Gable did not have a childhood. He had a tenure as a living memorial. He grew up on the ranch, surrounded by the physical weight of his father's life. Strangers would stop his mother in the street, pulling back the blanket of the stroller not to see a baby, but to hunt for the ears, the heavy brow, the dimples. They looked for Clark Gable in the boy's face, and when they found traces of him, they projected their grief and their adoration onto a child who could not speak. When they didn't find enough resemblance, they expressed disappointment, as if the boy had failed a casting call. The psychological burden on John was immense. He was raised in the shadow of a monolith. He was the posthumous son, a phrase that defined him by who was missing rather than who was present. As he grew older, the pressure to be his father intensified. The industry watched him. When he showed no interest in acting, preferring to dismantle engines and race dirt bikes, the media treated it as a betrayal. He was expected to inherit the charm, the voice, and the swagger. Instead, he was a quiet, introverted young man who just wanted to drive fast enough to outrun the ghost. While the world obsessed over the legitimate heir in the spotlight, there was another child, living just a few miles away, who carried the Gable blood in total secrecy. The story of Judy Lewis is the dark inverse of John Clark Gable's life, and it reveals the true depth of the studio's ruthlessness. The explanation for this abandonment lies in the machinery of 1935. In 1935, Clark Gable was filming The Call of the Wild with Loretta Young. He was married to Rhea Langham. Young was a devout Catholic starlet, the epitome of Hollywood purity. When their affair resulted in a pregnancy, it was a crisis that threatened to destroy 2 careers and cost the studio millions. A child born out of wedlock would have violated the morality clauses in their contracts. It would have turned the king into an adulterer and the saint into a sinner. The solution MGM and Loretta Young engineered was a conspiracy of silence that lasted for decades. It was a cover-up executed with the precision of a military operation. Loretta Young disappeared to Europe to hide the bump. She returned to a secret house in Venice, California, to give birth to a daughter, Judy. But they couldn't just hide the child. They had to launder her existence. Loretta Young placed her own biological daughter in an orphanage. She left her there, amidst the squalor and the loneliness of the system, for months. She did this to create a paper trail. Then, in a grotesque piece of theater, she adopted the child back. She gave interviews to fan magazines about her decision to take in a poor orphan. The public applauded her charity. They had no idea they were cheering for a mother who had put her child in a cage just to protect her box office receipts. Clark Gable knew he was complicit. He signed off on the plan. He allowed his daughter to be discarded and then reclaimed as a prop in a publicity stunt. He prioritized his career over his paternity. Judy Lewis grew up in Hollywood, the daughter of a famous single mother, noticing that she had ears that stuck out, ears that she had surgically pinned back at a young age to hide the resemblance. She noticed that a man named Uncle Clark would sometimes visit the house. There is one specific encounter that defines the tragedy of Gable's relationship with his daughter. One afternoon when Judy was 15, Gable visited Loretta Young's home. He found Judy in the front hallway. He didn't tell her who he was. He sat with her for an hour, asking her about her life, her boyfriend, her grades. He stared at her with a melancholy intensity. Before he left, he leaned in and kissed her on the forehead. Then he walked out the door, got into his car, and drove away. He never acknowledged her again. He never paid a dime of child support. He never mentioned her in his will. To acknowledge Judy would have been to admit the lie, and for Clark Gable, the lie was the foundation of his existence. He took the secret to his grave, leaving Judy to find out the truth from a stranger's whisper when she was 31 years old. The contrast between the two children is a testament to the cruelty of the star system. John was crushed by the weight of the name. Judy was erased by the lack of it. Both were sacrifices on the altar of the Gable legend. By the mid-1960s, the Gable industry began to run low on inventory. The movies had been re-released. The tributes had been written. The widow was living quietly. The studio needed one final liquidation event to extract the remaining value from the asset. They decided to sell the ranch, the 20-acre estate in Encino, the place where Gable had hidden from the world, where he had mourned Carole Lombard, where he had raised his guns and his dogs, was put on the market. But before the developers arrived with their bulldozers to carve the land into suburban plots, there was an auction of the contents. It was a liquidation of his most private memories. In typical Hollywood fashion, nothing was too sacred to sell. The auctioneers tagged and cataloged everything. They sold his hunting rifles. They sold his fishing rods. They sold the scripts with his handwritten notes in the margins. They sold the customized 1955 Ford Thunderbird he loved to drive. Collectors descended like vultures. They bought his clothes, hoping that owning a jacket would transfer some of his masculinity to them. They bought his pipes. They bought the mundane debris of his daily life. But the items that commanded the most attention were the ones that revealed the cracks in the armor. The auction exposed the letters and telegrams between Gable and Lombard. These were not the polished love notes of a screen couple. They were the desperate, anxious, sometimes mundane messages of two people trying to hold on to each other in a storm. They revealed a Gable who was insecure, who worried about his hairline, who worried about money, who was terrified of losing the love he had found. The dismantling of the house was the final violation. The developers razed the stone and timber structure. They tore down the barn. They uprooted the walnut trees Gable had planted with his own hands. The sanctuary was erased, replaced by a subdivision of luxury homes. The physical space where Clark Gable had been a person, not a star, was wiped off the map. In the years that followed, a strange thing happened to the Gable brand. The culture shifted. The 1960s bled into the 1970s, and the definition of American manhood began to change. The sexual revolution, the rise of feminism, and the emergence of the anti-hero in cinema made the Gable archetype look archaic. The scene in Gone with the Wind, where Rhett Butler carries a struggling Scarlett O'Hara up the staircase, a scene that had made audiences swoon in 1939, began to be viewed through a new lens. It looked less like romance and more like assault. The aggressive, dominant masculinity that Gable had perfected, the I don't give a damn attitude, started to feel predatory rather than charming. New stars like Dustin Hoffman, Al Pacino, and Robert De Niro were redefining acting. They were vulnerable. They cried. They were messy. Compared to them, Gable's stoic, iron-jawed performance style seemed stiff, a relic of a time when men were not allowed to feel. Clark Gable became a statue. He was respected as a pioneer, but he was no longer relevant. He was a monument in a park that people walked past without stopping. The studio's success in freezing him as the king had ultimately doomed him to obsolescence. By refusing to let him evolve, by refusing to let him play broken, older, or weaker characters, they had trapped him in a time capsule. John Clark Gable, now a grown man, tried to navigate this shifting landscape. He briefly attempted an acting career, but the reviews were savage. The critics punished him for not being his father, and then punished him for trying to be. He eventually found solace in off-road truck racing, a sport where the noise was loud enough to drown out the comparisons. In the desert dust of Baja, covered in mud and grease, he found the only place where he could just be John. Judy Lewis, meanwhile, fought for her own narrative. In 1994, she wrote a memoir, Uncommon Knowledge, revealing her parentage. The reaction from the old Hollywood guard was ferocious. They called her a liar. They called her a traitor. Even 30 years after Gable's death, the loyalty to the silence policy ran deep. People like Loretta Young's friends and the surviving studio publicists attacked Judy for tarnishing the image of the stars. They preferred the beautiful lie to the messy truth. The meeting between John and Judy was inevitable but strained. They were strangers connected by nothing but a dead man's DNA. There was no great cinematic reconciliation. They were two survivors of a shipwreck, checking to see who else had made it to shore. The final insult to the Gable legacy came in 1996 at another auction. This time, it was Christie's in Los Angeles. The item on the block was the Holy Grail, Clark Gable's Best Actor Oscar for It Happened One Night. The Oscar is supposed to be a symbol of artistic merit, a recognition by peers of a job well done. But in 1996, it was just a gold-plated paperweight worth a lot of money. The Academy had since changed its rules to prevent the sale of statuettes, but Gable's predated the restrictions. It was legal to sell it. The bidding was aggressive. The price climbed higher and higher. It eventually sold for $607,500. The buyer was Steven Spielberg. Spielberg didn't buy it to put on his mantle. He bought it to give it back to the Academy. He returned it to the archives, taking it off the market forever. It was a noble gesture, but the fact that it was necessary spoke volumes. The industry had so thoroughly commodified Clark Gable that even his highest honor had to be rescued from the auction block by a wealthy benefactor. The man from Ohio, who wanted to be a farmer, who loved fixing tractors and hated tuxedos, had been completely consumed. His home was gone. His children were scattered and scarred. His personal effects were in the hands of strangers. His awards were sold for cash. What remained was the image, the shadow on the screen, the smile, the wink, the lie. If you go to Forest Lawn today, you can stand in front of the crypt. It is clean, white, and silent. It gives nothing away. It tells you that Clark Gable is resting there with his wife. It doesn't tell you about the daughter he ignored. It doesn't tell you about the son he never held. It doesn't tell you about the alcohol or the motorcycle rides at 3 a.m. It is the perfect studio ending. It is a set that will never be struck. But the debris of the crash didn't stay on the mountain. It rained down on everyone who ever got close to him. The tragedy of Clark Gable wasn't that he died young. It was that he lived long enough to see himself turned into a product, and he didn't have the strength to stop the assembly line. The story ends not with a bang, but with a ledger. The studio balanced the books. The profit was made. The cost was merely a few human lives, which, in the grand scheme of Hollywood accounting, is a price they were always willing to pay.